We will be bearing the consequences if things go further in the bad direction. Then we need to get to a common position. And I will repeat what I said at the gates of Gaza. The killing of innocent civilians really needs to stop.
And for more, let's cross to Brussels and France 24 correspondent Dave Keating. Alexander De Croo there was speaking going into that day 2 of negotiations. How deep were those divisions?
The divisions are quite deep. I mean, there's 4 countries that have been pushing very hard for the EU to call for a ceasefire. That is Ireland, Belgium, Spain, and Malta. But all of those leaders, as they were entering the European Council, said the EU has to say something. The EU can't be silent on this. So Council President Charles Michel said that they were not planning to issue conclusions on Gaza. But these 4 leaders, several leaders, said coming in, look, we can't be silent on this. We can't pretend it's not happening. But in the end, they did not issue any conclusions on Gaza. And you could see some of those leaders were really visibly frustrated when they were leaving. Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar coming out saying that if they had tried to get common conclusions on the Gaza issue, they would have been there for many, many, many hours and probably would have just agreed to something that wouldn't have been satisfactory to anyone. This summit was actually supposed to go much longer than this. There were people talking about it going on till Sunday because all of these issues involved, but effectively they kind of threw in the towel on a lot of these issues. On Gaza, they just kind of gave up. But you know, these prime ministers, including Varadkar, were pointing out that in this last UN vote, a vast majority of EU countries did not vote against a ceasefire. Most supported the call for a ceasefire. There were only 2 countries that voted against it, Austria and Czechia. Those are the countries, along with Germany, who I'm told today could not live with any language calling for a ceasefire. There is a feeling that, from them at least, that until the US calls for a ceasefire, the EU should not move forward and call itself for a ceasefire.
Yeah, Dave, we heard you mentioned there the Irish Prime Minister. He was saying Ireland won't go it alone. But if there is no unanimity, particularly when it comes to sanctioning extremist West Bank settlers, there would try to be a core, let's say, I'm paraphrasing here, a core number of EU nations that jointly would do so.
Yeah, and they discussed this actually at this summit. They discussed the issue of the settlers, the violent settlers in the West Bank who are attacking Palestinians. They couldn't find any agreement on anything to say in the conclusions about that. But what Ireland and several other countries are calling for is for the EU to bar entry to those settlers who are accused or who have been found to be committing those violent acts, along with the entry bans that, of course, apply to Hamas, which is already designated as a terrorist organization in the European Union. So there is some hope. Varadkar said as he left, he is hoping that he can get an EU agreement on this. But if not, Ireland will move ahead and ban entry to those settlers and have sanctions for those settlers found to be engaged in violence.
All right. It's possibly a summit to forget, finishing sooner than a lot of people thought. And if you still had the feeling at the closing press conference that there was the hangover of Viktor Orban refusing to sign on for a 4-year, €50 billion lifeline for Ukraine. Let's listen to the French president, Emmanuel Macron.
It is precisely in the coming months that I expect Viktor Orban to behave like a European and not hold political progress hostage, since he is respected and his legitimate interests and duties are taken into account. If the conditions objectively set and measured by the Commission are not met, there will be no opening of negotiations.
This is a more straightforward story. There's one outlier, and it's Viktor Orban.
Yeah, this is less complicated because you have 26 of the 27 countries that do support this aid to Ukraine. There's no question about that. It is just one country, Hungary, but of course Hungary can veto this. Now, Viktor Orban was threatening to veto 2 things at this summit, so this was very much the Orban show here yet again. He was threatening to veto both the start of accession talks for Ukraine and this money. Now, 10 million euros of EU funds that had been frozen to Hungary because of Orban's rule of law violations. Those were released to Hungary on Wednesday night, the night before the start of the summit. That's 10 billion out of the total 30 billion that's been withheld. This was widely seen as a quid pro quo, some called it bribery, in order to get Orban to end his veto. But he kind of ended the wrong veto. He ended the veto on the start of accession talks, which is not really an urgent situation. Ukraine was worried about the signal it would send if that didn't happen today, but really there's no practical implication of that happening now or if it happened in a year. We're talking about one step among many, many steps in a 10-year process, and they've already gotten the most important one, which was designation of candidate status already for months now. So the fact that that 10 billion euros only unlocked the veto on accession is a bad sign, because it probably means Orban is expecting more cash to be thrown his way by the Commission before he'll end his veto on the EU aid. Now, there's another way around him. The EU aid can be taken out of the EU budget. They can create a new mechanism for just 26 of the 27 EU countries, and then Orban can't veto it. That is a very undesirable outcome, because it would basically move the whole Ukraine framework out of the EU framework, which looks really bad. It's also very complicated legally. It would need the approval of the European Parliament. They don't want to do that. However, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said tonight that the Commission will prepare that as a plan B for an emergency summit that they're going to call it for the end of January or early February to discuss only this issue. They will see if they can get Orban over the line. If they can't, the Commission is going to come with this plan B prepared to take the money out of the EU budget so as to bypass him.
Dave Keating, the summit's over, but your working day's not done. We'll be crossing to you in the next hour in the world this week and asking you now if the EU takes its cues from Washington, where senators have decided to stay in session an extra week to